Hello, everyone, and welcome to Rainbow Space Magic. This is the sixth conference. This panel is writing about the past as a way of talking about the present. I'm Tucker Lieberman, and I'm just going to give you a few logistics before our panelists introduce themselves. You're welcome to use the chat to talk to each other and share recommendations in a respectful manner. If you'd like to submit a question to the panel, please use the Q&A function. You can put a question mark before your question so it's obvious for the tech person and panelists that you're asking a question. There will be time for questions closer to the end of the panel, but feel free to write them as you think of them. After the panel, the conversation can continue on the Discord channel for this panel. So, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jessica Lucci, who will be our moderator.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our power-packed panel of wonderful, amazing sci-fi and fantasy authors. And as we were just saying, writing about the past as a way of talking about the present. This world is a lot right now, but setting our stories in other times and other worlds can make discussing all this a bit easier. I would like to introduce myself. I'm Jessica Lucci. I'm a poet and steampunk author. For those of you who don't know, steampunk is like science fiction fantasy from a Victorian standpoint. For instance, if we had gone a different way with technology, history would have gone a different way. I'm best known for my Watch City series and my new release, Rivets and Revolution, a mucka steampunk retelling of the days leading up to the American Revolutionary War. And here, joining me, we have E.H. Lupton. She, they, lives in Madison, Wisconsin. Her debut novel, Dionysus in Wisconsin, was shortlisted for the Lambda Literary Award in 2024, and her poetry has appeared in, most recently, Asimov's science fiction. In her spare time, she enjoys fiber arts, running long distances, and painting. Our next panelist is Gideon Marcus, creator of The Galactic Journey, which is a portal to exactly 55 years ago. It's basically a time travel LARP where we pretend we live in the past, and there we review science fiction, talk about space shots, and of course, discuss the latest queer and feminist news. It's currently 1970. Thomas Wrightson is an author of speculative fiction, born and raised in the United Kingdom, and a lover of both classic genre titles and Japanese anime and manga. His works include the Cluster Cycle, a five-part science fiction series. The first two, Starborn Vendetta and Lost Station Circe, are available now. And the upcoming audio drama, The Angry House from Alternative Stories, producers of Emily Inkpen's The Dex Legacy. And last but not least, we have Robin S. Blackwood, who is an author of queer science fiction and fantasy with a strong interest in older science fiction fantasy and in folklore and queer interpretations of both. Their story in Wild and Full of Marvels, an upcoming anthology of queer folklore retellings, reimagines Robin Hood and Marion as queer outlaws in a medieval setting. So I'm so excited to talk with each of you about our important topic of writing about the past as a way of talking about the present. So I would like to segue by saying when we do not learn from it, history repeats itself. I'm sure we've all heard that from a history professor at some point. Particularly repeating is the injustices and horrors that hurt people personally and broadly. So I would like to think about what queer science fiction or fantasy story of yours, each of my panelists, challenges our understanding of history. So what queer science fiction or story has challenged our understanding of history? I'll start with Gideon, since Gideon is first on my screen. So Gideon, what have you written that challenges our understanding of history?
So the thing about Galactic Journey that was really interesting, we started this project in 1958, which would be 2013 to everybody else. And a lot of people said, hey, you guys are kind of, I don't know, woke for 1958, aren't you? People weren't really feminist or into gay rights at the time, were they? And one of the great things we've discovered being on the journey is, yes, people were, and maybe they were at a further end of the bell curve than they are now. But it was still a live big thing. You know, several years before Stonewall, we had a trans-led riot in San Francisco in '66. And so the most important aspect to my work, I think, is showing that even in the past, which we think of as a monolith and as alien, and people just weren't, you know, their minds weren't liberal yet. We were there back then, just as we are now, and the only difference is we were a little more in the closet.
Wow, I really like that understanding that we have been there. We were there. And yeah, our under being closeted definitely, I think, had an impact on society in general. Now to Thomas, who's next on my screen. What fantasy story of yours has challenged our understanding of history?
Personally, it's not published yet, but I've written fantasy works that explore concepts of gender and sexual identity that have become lost with the Hollywood style patriarchal treatment of history. I mean, it's a bit of a hobby horse of mine and other people in the UK, but the conflict's become known as the War of the Roses. A lot of the background politics was driven by women more than it was by men, or or aspects of the concepts of knights and knighthood. There was a strong homoerotic. I mean, there's a whole video by Kaz Rowe about the homoerotic, homosocial elements of knights that is present in old Arthurian stories. But yeah, it's one of those factors that I look into, because if you try to do what is popularly done with those older periods, whether in fantasy or you're going into sci-fi with sci-fi interpretations of those periods, then you're falling into the trap of believing what a very narrow slice of history is telling us about 3, 4, 5,000 years worth of it. Especially since for a long time the dominant media portrayal has been America within and post Jim Crow. So a very straight, white, male, heteronormative view of everything that they're currently forcing people to go back to with tear gas and terrorist tactics.
Wow, that's so poignant, that parallel. Yeah. And I think that's why it's important for you and for all of us to continue to write in this way. Robin, what story of yours challenges our understanding of history?
Well, again, on the subject of we have always been here, that seems to be a really recurring theme here in this discussion. That Robin Hood story that you mentioned, that I mentioned in my bio, queer medieval outlaws. I mean, people do sometimes exist, like, people exist in every time period who don't fit in with the stereotypes of that time period. People will talk as if there were no queer people in medieval times, but at any time period you look at, you can find queer people. And so I did quite a bit of research for this story and discovered that at one point, queerness was actually maybe less of a big deal than it was seen as later on. And then the church changed its position on it, started treating it as a bigger thing than it had been treated as previously. And people were actually outlawed for it. And I'm not the first person to connect Robin Hood with queer outlaws. There's some very interesting writing on that topic, especially since early versions of the Legend of Robin Hood, Marion actually wasn't a character. And so Robin was portrayed as closest to the other male outlaws. of course, in my story, I also go into the plot line of marrying Jessing as a boy, so that relationship between robbing and marrying is not a straight romance in that version. But yeah, there's a lot that I found out about just how much more common queerness was in any time period that people think, yeah, it can't have happened.
And I love that how you use folklore to bring attention to these issues and to create something that's not just enjoyable, but gives you a different perspective. I think that's so cool.
Thank you.
And you're welcome. And E.H. Lupton, what's fantasy story of yours challenges our understanding of history?
Yeah, it's an exciting question. So I write mostly urban fantasy set in like 1969, 1970 era. Yeah, see. And one reason that I decided to start talking about Dionysus as a character um, is that he's often kind of these days dismissed as like the god of drunkenness, right? We have like these tremendous paintings, Renaissance paintings of a guy with like a grapes and holding out a wine and whatever. But like one thing that you see if you read the Bacchae, and I think that there's a African uh, Nobel laureate actually, Wole Soyinka, did a amazing translation of this that really brings it out, is that he was like a threat to the political status quo, right? Like a lot of his followers were like slaves and women and people who didn't have power traditionally, but then because of like the power that he gave them, like of tearing people apart, I guess, that they gained they were a threat to Pentheus and to the city. So that was really kind of an interesting thing if you talk about that and like the political unrest of the late 1960s environment sort of generally like the end of the it's not really the end of the Vietnam War, like that just grinds on and on, but it was like the height of the protests, like 1970. I guess I try to I think of that as like the height of the Vietnam protests because here in Madison, somebody blew up the physics building in August of that year. So that was like the locally the high point. High point is a positive thing usually, isn't it? But like the big thing that happened. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. So I like that you're writing from the 1960s and early 70s when America was at war in a very terrible situation. And how you built that into your stories, I think is really commendable. And is there anybody I've missed or anybody they want to add something on that subject before we move on to the next question? Okay.
Did Tucker get to talk? Sorry.
Well,
Oh,
no. I'm listening, and
yeah.
I am pleased to be here present with you. But I'm going to let this be your panel.
Okay, I got confused. Sorry.
Awesome.
Thanks, Tucker. Um, no, we talked a little bit through about how our work has paralleled modern issues, and about world building being part of our research. I'm sure you all can attest to, like, and you've all spoken about some deep dives you've gone into, like on Dionysus and ways to, like, I'm sure you all have so much knowledge about stuff that you never knew you'd have knowledge about in your research. Um, but let's move on and talk about fear and courage in writing truth that contradicts popular opinion, religious institutions, educational systems, and politics. So right now we are in across the world, the whole globe is being affected by historic actions. And can we find ways, what ways have we found in our science fiction fantasy to parallel that, solve that, investigate that, and what courage it takes as a writer to use our freedom of speech and freedom of the press to put that out there, knowing that we become a target for speaking our minds. So, the fear and courage in writing truth that contradicts popular opinion, religious institutions, educational systems, and politics. Have any of you ever had a fear of that or a thought about that in your writing? How about Gideon? Have you ever thought about that in your own writing career?
So I think E.H. Lupton will resonate with this. There's something special about 55 years ago. It is very resonant with modern day, and it has been throughout the time that we've been doing it. And 1970 feels a great deal like now. And when I talk to people, it's a great way to talk about the present while talking about the past, because I'll find people talking about, oh my God, this has never happened before. National Guard stationed in our cities and a president weaponizing the Justice Department, Republicans not caring about the rights of minorities. This is unprecedented. And one of the great things about talking about that is we can say it was the same back then, but worse, and it got better because we fought. And sure, we get hate mail occasionally. People will comment and go, you know, I used to like this journey, but you stopped talking about science fiction and talked about all this woke shit. You mean the 4 kids who were gunned down at Kent State and the hard hat riot that followed the that and yeah. So anyway, the long story short is 1970 resonates so well with now that you can't help talking about now by talking about then. And because it was worse then and got better, there's a glimmer of hope always present in that.
Wow, that feels so good to me. That's so healing. I don't know if anybody else feels that, but knowing that we've been here before, history has repeated itself into our present, but we've been here before and we can overcome this. I love that. I love that. And let's move on to E.H. Lupton because I'm sure that you have your own your own viewpoint that you would like to touch on this subject.
I mean, like, I totally agree. I feel like it was maybe John Oliver called the Trump administration like stupid Nixon. And I keep going back to that and like rereading some of the writings of Hunter S. Thompson from the era and just feeling like you know, like there was a time when people didn't trust the government because the government was genuinely very terrible and, you know, things did get better. And it's interesting. I also am part of a podcast called Ask Medievalist. And I'm not the medievalist myself. I'm the interviewer. My my cousin, who's a medievalist, also does some classical theater. So we were talking. We did an episode about like the Bronze Age collapse, and it was very surprising to me that a lot of people seemed to really enjoy that episode. And this idea that like humanity had been through all these cataclysms and come out the other side and like went on to write the works of Homer and stuff like that, that like you can survive. So I think that's an important message right now. My favorite review, by the way, I think this is sort of relevant. We had recorded an episode about motherhood in the Middle Ages, and we recorded it just after I had a kid. So I had like zero sleep. Was not thinking. And then when I edited it, I thought, oh wow, we keep referring to like all of these people who are having babies as female, but like we don't know how they define themselves, right? Like that's one of the interesting things about studying the Middle Ages is like the vast majority of time we don't have information about like did they think of themselves as female? Did they think of themselves as something else? so I just put in a little disclaimer at the beginning that, like, obviously not everybody who has babies is a woman, but we use this terminology throughout. Sorry, I was like not thinking, had slept 3 hours or whatever. And we got a review that said, this podcast is too woke. He's like, because of that disclaimer, apparently. So what I've learned is that you're just never going to make everybody happy, no matter what terminology you decide to use. But like, it's better to stand up for what you think, I guess.
You know what? You raise such an important point of being authentic, and the way that you presented that disclaimer in the beginning, I think was very well done. And being too woke because of that just shows either somebody needs to open their minds and actually really tune in and listen to voices like ours and learn something, or at least let themselves be exposed to a different point of view. But when you shut yourself off from other points of view, that's when we get misgendered. That's when we get misnamed. That's when we get labeled, and it doesn't feel good. So, but the fact that only one person complained and said it was woke, that actually means you're doing a good job if you piss somebody off. You did a good job.
I hope so.
And moving on to Robin, what times have you had fear or courage in writing your truth? Has that come up in your writing at all?
I feel like for me, I mean, I write under a pen name, so there's that aspect of I made a deliberate choice that people would not, who just know me day to day, necessarily always be able to connect my writing to me. So there's that. In general, I am fortunate enough to not feel like I'd be endangering my day-to-day life if my writing was connected to me, which is obviously not the case for everyone, and I've been very fortunate in that way. I have online encountered, you know, people who are very prejudiced, hostile. Most of them, though, honestly, just trolls rather than people who I felt these people are going to become a danger to me in real life. And I found the people who are these horrible prejudiced trolls, they are outnumbered. They are outnumbered by people who want to see queer stories, who want to see diverse stories of all kinds, even though sometimes the prejudiced people can be very loud about it.
Wow. So I'm hearing a lot of hope from you that there are trolls and there are people who just want to tear us down or just be miserable. But like you said, you pointed out, they're the minority. The majority of us do care and respect. And we have to make our voices as loud as the minority because trolls just bring everybody down.
Yeah, definitely. I also think, there's people out there who might not be these horrible, prejudiced, aggressive people, but who might lack understanding and who can actually, discover things from reading our stories. I know for a fact that someone who told me when I was a teenager and I first wrote a story in which a character used they, them, and this person was confused by the grammar of this and said that can't be correct grammar. How does that work? Is now someone who's very supportive of me writing queer characters. So, I'm not going to say that a story will completely change the world, completely change the political situation, but it can definitely give someone a new perspective.
Wow, and good for you for not backing down from the grammar police who don't understand they and them. I've encountered that with an editor, and they they became first they were trying to correct my grammar, but then they understood how important it is to write characters authentically. And she's gone on to edit many more of my things since then. But so I think
That's
we've done
great,
a good
really.
thing
Yeah.
there. Yeah. How about Thomas? Did I touch on you with this yet, or are we? Yes, Thomas.
Uh, well, this kind of thing is not something that's happened yet. I tend to safeguard myself in terms of what I can write because I fit a particularly non-minority stereotype. I'm male, I look straight, but also I tend to clothe my stories in other things. So my upcoming book, I did a reading from it yesterday, The Murderer's Lament. I based the happenings of that story's background and some of the plot points on the first Trump administration. And I
Ah,
wrote most of it from 2020 during COVID through to 2021 after the Capitol riots. And one of the characters is based on a certain person who shall not be named. Uh, I was actually worried that it would lose relevance if we got a Democrat, if rather not I live in the UK. If the US got a second Democrat term, they didn't, and it has become too topical, I think, almost, because, I mean, I won't spoil it, but there's stuff in there that anyone who can read between the lines will point out. And I was a bit worried that my editor would ask me to tone it down, but he is very much on my side in terms of things like that. So I think a combination of me just framing things like that strongly in another plot and creating characters before I create sexuality means that I've hopefully created enough of a boundary that I can tell these stories with full conviction and truth while still skating round some of the hiccups that will cause it to be. I mean, anything can be censored at the moment, but that may cause it to be very overtly censored. Of course, I'm saying that about a book that has a very explicitly stated lesbian couple, so it'll probably get banned in several libraries. I don't know.
let's all try to get our books banned. Let's be brave enough to get banned. But you never know who's gonna, you never know. You never know who's gonna step up or defend us, and you never know who's gonna try to tear us down. But what I'm hearing overall from the group is a lot of hope. But my next question, which leads me right into this, I'm gonna stay with you if you don't mind. Um, you mentioned your characters, and tell me about a time when one of your characters had to take a risk to protect someone.
Oof. that
Sorry, I
that
put you on the
really
spot a
it's
bit.
really awkward because it depends what you're thinking of in terms of risk. Because I tend to write stories that have action elements, so and also they're science fiction and fantasy. Literally anything can happen. But I think that taking a risk. I think the thing that oh boy.
Well,
Okay.
anytime your
I think I've got an
characters are involved in action and adventure, I think that's brave, and it shows how they would act in other situations too.
actually I have got an example. It's from my latest book, Lost Station Sea. The whole thing about the mother and daughter, not the mother and daughter, mother and son, sort of adopted, and due to, oh, sorry, did you want to?
Mm.
Oh,
No, I
sorry,
was just coughing. I'm listening in raptly.
sorry. But the core concept, the core conflict between those two is that she killed his biological parents, but in a kind of weird bravery action sort of thing, she still raised him as a son. And there is a conflict, but also weird bravery there because at the end they do. openly discuss this really weird quandary that they find themselves in, because they have the love of mother and son, but also they are rivals who have agreed to a duel to the death over an established grudge. That's the kind of thing I tend to put in my stories more than just wide spanning stuff, just those kinds of really unpleasant to think about, potentially, conflicts that people have. And I'm sure you can think of loads of different things in history or in pop culture or in the news stories. Really messy family situations that when you look at it from the outside, you think, oh my goodness, that is so incredibly toxic. How can they function? And I'm not saying it's not toxic, but it's, you know, it's I mean, on the male part of this, I sort of vaguely count as queer because they have a canonical partner, love interest who uses they them. So I guess that counts. Yes, problem with me. I think about characters first and not sexuality. So
That's not a problem. And for those of you who don't know, we were on a panel last year about queer normative fiction. And so if people want to check back to last year's panel, you get a lot of information about that there. And I think it's very valid that your characters don't have to be waving pride flags and saying, I'm queer, I'm queer. It can be written into the story as the character it, without it being their sole main focus of their personality. Um, so thank you so much for sharing all that with us. Now, I'm going to go back to Gideon. Can you tell me about a time when one of your characters took a risk to protect somebody?
So interestingly enough, the because we're the journey, right? We're both fiction and fact at the same time. So really any bravery that happens is on the part of the writers acting as their characters. And what's interesting is there are things that were brave then and things that are brave now. So for instance, we have several people, transgender people, who write under the honorific mix, MX dot, right? Which did exist in 1970. And that is both scary then and scary now, although it was less scary in some ways to be transgender in the late 60s than it is now. People didn't bat an eye at oh, this person had a sex change. It wasn't a big deal culturally. One, because it wasn't happening that much, and two, the issue they were trying to protect back then was firm gender roles, not your ability to switch genders. But there's other things that we'll take stands on that may not have been so controversial back then, but might be now. So for instance, I wrote a piece on the Six-Day War. And I wrote a piece, and it was from the Israeli perspective, and it talked about how there was this tremendous victory in 6 days over all the Arabs that were trying to destroy Israel. And Jessica Dickinson Goodman, who's one of our best writers and tends to focus on queer issues, said, I want to write the counterpoint from the Palestinian point of view, which in 1967, most people were not writing about the Palestinian point of view. Of course, that's very relevant today and something of a lightning rod. So I'm very proud that we put both sides up there. I'll make one final point, and this isn't my story, but this is a story that I've published under Journey Press, so I'll take it. In 1963, Tom Purdom, who, Robin, since you love old science fiction, you may know of Tom Purdom because he just died last year, but he'd been writing for 70 years, one of the longest tenures of any science fiction author. And when he wrote in 1963, he wrote what was the very first novel to positively portray a queer couple in science fiction. It took place 800 years in the future. And I asked him, why did you have this book with these out couples and polyamory and all this way out there stuff for 1963? And he said, I wanted to depict the future in shorthand. And I couldn't think of a better way to say this is not now, this is a completely different time, than by having a queer couple and not making any big deal about it.
Wow, I love that. And that's how I think it's our goal generally in our community to be treated equally and accepted. And I think that future is coming and we're in the midst of it. And I that's very fascinating that back in 60 years ago, they were writing about or they were writing, not 60 years ago, but they were writing about a time in the past that shows a providential future where it's really, we can be out and it's not a big deal. It's part of the culture, how it should be. And now we were talking about that era, so I'm going to flip again to E.H. Lupton again, because it's kind of the same time frames that we're talking about. When did one of your characters take a risk to protect somebody?
Oh boy. So I just this past spring had this book come out. Sorry, it's called Lazarus Home from the War. And it is about a guy who came back from the Vietnam War. And I felt like I had a very mixed view of the war, having like I lived in Vietnam for a year or so. I had met a lot of people who lived through the war as children in both in in Hanoi and in the South. And also like you grow up in the US, it's not talked about the way that war is like the World War II, where we were obviously the heroes and like the great conquering whatever, until which is a viewpoint I held until I saw like a Doctor Who episode about World War II. I did not that was what changed anyway. Talk about Doctor Who on a different panel maybe. But so like obviously like my parents were hippies and protested in 68 in Chicago and whatever, and they had like this very common view at the time, like the US needs to get out of the war. It's not our thing. It's not our, we should not be doing it. And the flip side of that was always like, South Vietnam is a country and they've asked for our help, right? And like having met South Vietnamese people and who came here as refugees, I felt that was like more of an actual argument than like my parents had ever given it credit for. Um, But anyway, so in the middle of the book, the two main characters have this argument about it because one of them, obviously, he fought in the war. He doesn't like super hardcore person. I don't know that I could write somebody who was that blindedly patriotic, but felt like, like sometimes to do a thing, you have to feel like you believe in it. And his boyfriend is like, no, obviously the US is like doing a terrible thing over there and should get out of it. Um, they have a big fight about this. And as a result, our veteran goes and like gets captured by the bad guy, the demons. And then the boyfriend has to like actually think about rescuing him, like go out on a limb. And where he's like very much an intellectual and a doctor, and he's not somebody um who does like physical things, but he's put in this role of like action hero and kind of like trying to do a rescue. But then when they're reunited, it's the doctor tries to negotiate with the bad guy so that our veteran character also has to consider like how to solve problems peacefully instead of like with fisticuffs. So yeah.
Wow, I love that. And it's like the two characters almost had to switch roles in a way from being the more passive in a way, more peaceful one, um, becomes the superhero who has to go in and save this veteran who is a tough person. And then this veteran has to figure out for themselves what is the truth here? What is the truth, not just what I believe to be the truth. I think that's so brave of you that you did that. Um, Especially in a society where, at least in America, we are very trained to be militaristic and to admire that. Um, so I appreciate that you wrote that. Robin, tell me about a time when your character took a risk to protect somebody.
Okay, so I love these kinds of scenes, these kinds of stories. I love stories with danger and action and heroics and well, I can talk about the Robin Hood story again. I've talked about it quite a bit, but that has Marion having to infiltrate the castle to rescue John and then leading the sheriff's men on a chase through the forest. And it has sword fights, it has action, and all these characters taking very big risks for each other over the course of the story. I'm also working on a novel, also queer fantasy, quite different, much more secondary world, less strictly historical, but historically inspired still. And one of the main characters of that is very much the bold and reckless hero type. But the other is a character who starts out much more cautious, even at first quite self-interested, does not see himself as a brave or heroic man at all, but as he falls in love with the other main character, ends up risking everything for him, and that's something I really enjoy writing.
Wow, so love became his power, his superpower to be strong for this for their love interest. That's awesome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And Thomas, did we tell me about one of the time your characters took a risk to protect somebody?
Didn't we already cover
Oh, I'm
that?
so
He was
sorry.
first.
I'm so sorry. Let me get my glasses on. That would help me. Oh, yes, Thomas. How does writing in an alternate world make it easier to write about divisive issues? Now, I know you've talked about divisive issues within your writing, but how does writing in fiction make reality easier to talk about?
I think it's because you can create a distance. I could never be a news journalist, for instance, not only because I'd need to go to places like Israel and Gaza and Korea and Russia and Ukraine potentially, but because you're having to be in the present all the time. And especially now, that's just really stressful. But something I found to help me cope over the past few months is I was writing a cozy fantasy and I was able to use some of that stuff to be completely separate from real world issues, but also focus on writing a very people story that turned out to be something of an introspection and also have more comedy. But oh, it's yeah, basically writing in fiction means you can talk about things at a remove that means you can really discuss things. I mean, it's an old example, but Le Guin's Ro Rodican, I forget, but her sci-fi pentalogy, she was able to touch on some pretty explosive topics. I mean, the word for world is forest, which was basically the original and much better written Avatar, talked about humans basically destroying a culture by simply touching it, which has happened in our world. I mean, think of most of the Maori cultures, or oh, which was it? was it the left hand? No, it was, yes, it was. I think it was the left hand of darkness, where she discussed a third gender, basically transgendered species, decades before Mass Effect even attempted to touch it. And I mean, I've got an episode on my podcast talking specifically about Mass Effect, and one of the things I talk about is they are not brave enough to use they them pronouns, and they have no trans characters at all. That is a huge gap in their claim of representation. Also, the fact that Mass Effect 2 basically excised all queer content apart from problematic or tragic examples. I'm calling them out on that. But it's when you set the thing that's, I mean, Mass Effect is an example of it not doing that, but if you when you go into a speculative area, you can go wild in a way that also means you can write about them without feeling like someone's watching over your shoulder, or you feel the weight of the world, because you're not writing about queer discrimination in the 2020s. You're writing about it potentially maybe in medieval times, maybe in an alien culture. You know, it creates a separation and means you can write about it without getting a panic attack.
Yeah, good point. Because you can kind of your side, you can set yourself aside and step out of the present and make it in your imaginary world. It's a lot easier to handle. um, we have a couple of minutes left. I'm going to end the questions here, but if any of our panelists wanted to say a couple of words about this topic or about their own work or works that we've had talked a lot about works that we recommend. But I would like to open this up to question and answer for our audience, or any other things we would just like to discuss. Is there any questions and answers from our audience that we can address? Let's see. I have to get my handy dandy glasses back on. Okay, let's go. Let's go question and answers. Nobody chat. Let's see. Oh, somebody. Oh, I like this in the chat. Thomas Wrightson says, the UK has issues, but the US is very loud, in my opinion. And I think that lets us as writers be louder than what society is telling us. Because as we spoke about earlier, we might be the minority, but we are not but the minority. Our voices are just quieter. And if we can make our voices louder, and I say we as people who want peace, we are writers, we are science fiction fantasy writers, and we are such an important part of this culture. Because as Thomas was saying, it's easier to take some things in if it's in a digestible way of fantasy rather than the world's on fire. I want to thank all my panelists today. It has been an absolute pleasure to be with you all. And I encourage our audience to check out these panelists. We do have a Discord, so you can visit the Discord there. It's Rainbow Space Magic, and find out more about these creators and their podcasts, their writings, their articles, their books, and their LARPs. It's amazing. And what an amazing panel we have today. Thank you so much, everybody. And stay tuned for the next panel and for our readings that we're going to have later on in the day. So thank you very much. And I'm going to end this now with a final goodbye and see you later, everybody.
Thanks so much to all the panelists from Rainbow Space Magic. Thanks to Jessica for moderating. And again, join the conversation in the Discord. See you soon.